Welcome to the Beyond Organic Wine podcast. I'm Adam Huss, coming to you from the global epicenter for viticulture, Los Angeles, California. Okay, yeah, Los Angeles isn't the global epicenter for viticulture. And maybe where you're from isn't either. And that's okay. Don't force it. Grapes are great. But if you look around and don't see them growing in wild abundance without a lot of help, maybe where you're from does something else greater than grapes. Maybe the lack of grapes where you are is a message from the earth. Maybe it's an opportunity to be unique. When I stopped telling Los Angeles what kind of wine I wanted to make and started asking it what kind of wine it wanted me to make, this land led me to make the most popular wine that Centralis has ever made. A wine unlike any other in California. A wine that included some native Los Angeles prickly pears. Centralis is my winery, by the way, and the premier sponsor for this podcast. It seems to me that what we have called wine and revered as wine and created certifications and diplomas about is not actually wine. It's one perspective on one kind of wine from one region of the planet. And I think the first step, the lowest hanging fruit, if you will, to having an authentic local wine culture is simply using local ingredients. Put another way, culture grows from the earth. If it is imported and forced onto the land, it is neither sustainable, nor is it culture. Do we even know what American wine, or Australian wine, or Chilean wine actually tastes like? Or do we only know what French wine tastes like when you make it in various places around the world? My guests for this episode are the gentlemen of Hermit Woods Winery in New Hampshire, Ken Hardcastle, Chuck Lawrence, and Bob Manley. They have an incredible story of asking these questions and beginning a journey of discovering and creating their local wine culture. These guys are exploring unexplored territory in wine, and they have a lot of knowledge to share about what they are finding. The wines of Hermit Woods Winery are well-aged, dry, textured, complex, with great mouthfeel and nuanced aromas, but they aren't made from grapes. They're made from a blend of things like quince, daylily, kiwiberry, black raspberry, honey, rhubarb, and many other fruits and plants and herbs and flowers and spices that thrive in New Hampshire. They make about 35 different wines at least every year, and they've been at this for over 15 years. They started by asking, does it have to be a grape? And I think they've answered that question with an emphatic absolutely not. We cover their philosophy and their unique approach to winemaking in this conversation, and it is full of an inordinate amount of practical and helpful ideas for anyone who might want to consider joining this local wine movement. These guys are an incredible resource, whether for technical advice on navigating the particular challenges of fermenting things like tomatoes, or how long you need to wait before the Japanese knotweed wine stops smelling like baby wipes, or for how to reconstruct a metaphoric grape. Though this should be obvious, I think it's very important to point out that the diversity of ingredients that Hermit Woods uses supports, honors, and generates more biodiversity and more diversity of wines. There are many practical advantages to not relying on a single variety of fruit for your entire production. And also in the bigger picture, it leads to a healthier, more resilient, and more beautiful wine culture. These three friends are changing the world of wine as we know it, and they seem to be having a lot of fun doing it. Enjoy.
Campbell, an introduction. That's when we should speak over him.
Right. Perfect. I've hit record, so welcome you guys. Thank you, and feel free to talk over each other now to introduce yourselves. If you could all at least say your name, so the sound of your voice is associated with a name, at least for the moment, and people can figure out who you are maybe later as they listen.
Sure. My name is Ken.
I'm Chuck.
And I'm Bob.
Fantastic. And you guys as all together make up Hermit Woods Winery. Is that correct?
Correct.
And you were just about to say sort of what the culture is like there with Hermit Woods and how it's sort of related to this relationship that you guys have had for a long time, even prior to this winery.
Sure. Well, the three of us met as friends many years ago, probably close to 20 years ago or more. and we began spending a lot of time together, sharing our hobbies and a lot of mutual loves for a lot of different things, not the least of which was alcohol and everything related to the fermenting of and making of crafting of alcoholic beverages. Starting
Adam,
first.
I need to interrupt here just for a moment. When the truth of the fact is that Bob and Chuck discovered that I brewed beer, and they came over and proceeded to drink my beer as often as they could. That's really how it got started, I think.
I see.
Well, I think we drank your other alcohol too.
There's no doubt about that. The only reason I know you, Ken, as I say to everybody when I give a tour or talk about our history, is the only reason we know each other is because I don't know how to make beer, and I'm terrible at it. So, so somebody introduced me to Ken. Fortunately for you, so I had a choice to either spend time with Ken learning how to make better beer and go home and make beer myself, or my choice ultimately was to just spend more time with Ken and drink his beer. And I've never made beer again since meeting Ken. So it's worked out quite well, and it's resulted in the three of us spending an enormous amount of time together around the topic of fermentation. And it started with beer, and it rather rapidly after that branched off into fermenting just about anything and everything that we could get our hands on for the next 6 or 7 years before this thing actually materialized into an actual business. And I was describing this process as part of how, we talk about our video cast that we do every Monday night, and what we talk about. It's really because this business is about who we are as a trio. We often refer to ourselves as a photographer, a geologist, and a pilot start a winery, and this is what you get. And so it's really the conversation that is Hermit Woods is not just about wine and things fermentable, but it's about the culture that we've created by being together, by caring about this and having a passion for this, and sharing that passion, both in the form of the liquid that we create, as well as the relationship that we have with each other and with our guests.
I love that. Yeah.
And I don't know, Adam, if you've had a chance to mine our website or anything, but we make very unconventional wine. And,
well, that's why we're talking. Yes, I have.
It started, like Bob said there, as a love of fermenting and making beer, and then I got really into making mead. And my wife and I bought an old farmhouse here in central New Hampshire, and a bunch of fruit trees and berries on the property. And our son found some old beehives in the barn, so we set up beehives so we had good pollinators for our garden and access to fresh honey. And the previous owner had planted some cold hardy hybrids, some Maréchal Foch grapes, back in 1970 for the first legal winery in the state of New Hampshire. Wow. And those had laid fallow for 10 years prior to me buying the old farmhouse in 2003. So anyway, I had all this fermentable materials on the property, and Bob and Chuck and I started down this adventure of trying to make wine. And we were importing grapes, buying grapes from California, from Chile, and crushing them up and learning the process of making wine. And really, in a nutshell, we realized, of course, that the winemaker gets to nuance the process, the yeast, the temperature, the barrel aging, the press times, the maceration times, all those different things that you get to do as a winemaker. But really, it's the quality of the fruit really dictates and sets in motion the biggest aspect of what the resulting wine is going to be. And we realize that, of course, there are certain geographic regions on the planet where vinifera grapes grow superlatively, and not New Hampshire, not New England.
Right.
So we flipped it on its head.
Glad you noticed that.
We turned it around and we said, all right, what grows exceptionally well here on its own? And if we use the same approach that we would with classic vinifera grapes, could we make expressive wines that could cellar, that could pair well with food, that could take you down a magical path of the glass and enjoying that beverage? And we've been experimenting ever since and crafting very unique wines that speak completely of New England, but without using grapes at all in
So
our
no,
wines.
well, what happened to the Maréchal Foch?
I now have a guy who's really into working with old vines in
Okay.
a completely natural, hands-off format, and I've donated my vineyard to him to deal with. And
Okay.
he just harvested a few weeks ago.
You have to keep in perspective, it's a vineyard of 20 to 30 vines,
Yeah,
so
it's tiny.
not
I know.
commercially viable in any way at all.
Got it. And now those, okay, I mean, so we won't talk very long about those, but I heard about them. Is this are they being sprayed with anything at all?
So
No,
this is
they haven't been sprayed at all ever, which is something that I really like, and it's something that Bob and Chuck and I really enjoy with our food and with our beverages is to work with stuff that grows naturally well on its own. You don't
Right.
need sprays for wild blueberries. You don't need sprays for rhubarb. There's and if you don't want a perfectly spherical, shiny, beautiful looking apple, you don't need any sprays for the apples either, and they'll make
Right.
damn good cider or wine.
Right.
one of the things that we did in our experimenting in the early days when this really was just a hobby was we planted 120 vines of hybrid grapes that Marcel Foch was included in that as well, and we grew that vineyard on my property nearby for 5 or 6 years. But one of the things that we learned, other than the fact that at least I can speak for myself when I say I'm not a farmer, the
Uh,
Marcel Foch and other hybrid grapes, although they've been developed such that they will grow in colder climates, nonetheless, this part of the world is not an ideal climate for these types of fruit. And for that reason, most growers in the Northeast who are growing hybrid grapes are spraying them. And that's the only way they're able to make a successful vineyard work. There actually is only one exception that I know of for sure, and there's a guy that Ken is working with now that is working very hard to duplicate what the exception that I was going to refer to in Vermont. There's a woman in Vermont called she started a winery called Garagiste, and she's known throughout the country for the work she's done doing growing organic hybrid fruit. But she's got to be one of the best farmers there is. She's exceptional
I
at
just
it.
spent September working with her.
Okay,
Yeah.
so there you go. So there's very few farmers that are at her caliber and understand what she understands about the fruit, and for that reason, there are very few farmers growing hybrid grapes organically.
Right. But yeah, no, I mean, this is all good stuff. I'm glad to hear all this. I want to, if I can talk about your website for a second, because I think it's kind of like what obviously hooked me in, but it sounds like what you guys are doing is more foraging than farming. Is that correct?
well, we do some foraging, but it's a small percentage of what we actually use for our base materials. We source from a lot of different farmers, so we
Got
work
it.
closely with a lot of farmers, and some of those farmers do use sprays.
Okay.
Some do not.
Uh-huh.
Um, the largest crop that we ferment are wild blueberries from down East Maine,
Uh-huh.
and so these are a wild product that is harvested mechanically and by hand, and then cleaned, sorted, and flash frozen to a deep temperature. So we purchase
The
20
frozen.
20,000
Right.
pounds of frozen blueberries, which is great because I get to go through a cold soak maceration as they thaw and
Right, right. Yeah.
extract all sorts of great flavors and
Yeah, I've done
nuances
that
from
with,
berries.
I have a little front yard vineyard here, and of course, for whatever reason, there's only a few, similar to you guys with just like over a dozen vines or more, and of course they all ripen at different times. So it's like
Yeah,
I'll pick like a gallon and stick it in the freezer, and pick another gallon, stick it in the freezer, and then when they're all about ready, pick the rest, and then I use those gallons to like keep the must cool, just keep dropping in these gallons of frozen grapes in a similar way.
that's it. That's exactly how I got started with this whole process, Adam, was my own blackberries in my yard and getting out early in the morning before the birds would get to the ones that ripened. And those would go into a freezer bag. And I do that every day or every other day for a couple of weeks until I got all perfectly ripe blackberries. Because, just like in the grape world, you need fruit that's phenolically ripe. That's perfect. That's how you make good wine.
Right. Well, when you say, some of the farmers spray things, obviously you can spray organic substances. Are you working with both organic and non-organic farmers, or what's your...
Some are organic, some are non-organic. Most of them just sort of follow a smart, best practices format because sprays are expensive and they're toxic, and yet the livelihood of the farmer is dependent on their crop. So some of them will use sprays at different times, and I don't have the litany of the different chemicals, the timing, or all the aspects of what goes on. The farmers are the expert. They've made their choices, and I'm sort of at their mercy. I pick and choose to work with farmers that I respect philosophically. And they're all a little different in how they do things.
Right. Well, no, you say...
I would like to point out, you mentioned foraging. In the very early days of the winery, a lot of our fruit came from foraging. We each of us would have various areas or types of fruit that we had access to, and we were dealing with small enough quantities in the early days that we could forage for much of our fruit. We're dealing with volumes now that it's very difficult to forage the quantities that we need, find the time to do it. There are still a couple fruits that we use that are only brought into our winery through our own foraging, like rose hips, the Rosa rugosa plant. The only way we can get that fruit is to go and forage for it, because it doesn't exist in a commercial way in a fresh fruit form. So there's still some foraging going on, but not we can't do it at the scale we need to make the size batches we're making.
Yeah, got it. Now
we're at about 4,000 cases annual production.
Got it. Yeah, that's significant. That'll outstrip the local woods pretty quick. So you're, and I want to get into that. I want to get into some of like your fermentation specifically, especially rose hips, because I'm kind of fascinated by that. I've worked with that a little bit, but just more on the foundational level, like this approach that you guys take of just like looking rather than, what the, I don't even know how to describe it, but like what wine that I think before we start examining things and asking the questions that you guys are asking, you're just given spoon-fed this idea of wine that is vinifera, right? Everywhere around the planet, it's vinifera. Yep. What was it that made you, shift in that thinking, other than just, it was, you weren't getting great grapes from California and Chile, or were there philosophical things that you encountered, or just, I don't know, was there a moment or a series of moments that led to that? And have you encountered conflict in this thing? I mean, you do say you're proudly contrarian, right on your website.
Yeah, I'll answer it for myself anyway. And I know Bob and Chuck have their own ideas and perspectives on all of this. But for me, as a geologist, it seems to me there are always much larger forces at play than we understand. And as humans, we feel like we can control stuff, and we get in there and we grow monocrops and we figure shit out, and it's a mistake and it's delusional, and in my opinion. And so when we were making wine from imported grapes, and I quickly realized, wow, the character of this fruit really dictates the final product. I can nuance it a little bit, but it's really the fruit that matters. And we live in an area where that fruit doesn't grow. And even though the fruit grows in different parts of the world, there are only a few places where that fruit grows exceptionally well, where you have the Burgundy, the Napa Cab. You have certain areas where grapes grow exceptionally well, the Chenin Blanc in South Africa. And so it makes sense.
Vinifera grapes.
What's that?
You mean vinifera grapes?
Yeah, all these vinifera grapes. So So it really dawned that instead of trying to force something in with these hybrids or import stuff that's soaked in diesel shipping all the way across the country or across an ocean, why don't we look at what grows exceptionally well right here? It just seems philosophically to make so much more sense. We're going to be expressive of what is here. We're going to work with our environment. We're going to stay close and local all the way through to the finished product. And we will be able to capture the uniqueness of New England, not by trying to force hybrids to grow here, but by looking at wild blueberries and looking at rhubarb. You can't kill the stuff here. It just pops up out of the ground, grows. So that just made a lot of sense. And I really we've kept to that all the way through. So many people say, "Oh, why don't you use blood oranges or avocados or mangoes?" And it's like, well, that's not really what grows here. And so for me, that really is the thing that drives me every day. I wake up excited to ferment something new or see what the hell kiwi berries will do under a carbonic maceration. That's the fun, and it's a total frontier. There's no pathway. There's nobody else doing this that we know of, because I'd love to compare notes. If someone else is picking rose hips and table ripening them and then putting them through carbonic or pseudo-carbonic maceration and fermenting them.
So you're treating rose hips like apples, essentially, letting them go through a milling process and then before sort of crushing them and fermenting them.
What's that? Sorry?
You're treating rose hips like apples then, sort of like the way that you would pick apples, but then let them sit around for a couple weeks and soften.
A little bit. No, it's not that long. It's not like sweating apples. It has to do with the process of foraging and the time involved and trying to get the harvest and the way rose hips ripen. By the time they're fully ripe, they're so soft that when you go to pick them, you kind of smear them off the plant. And so they're picked a little bit underripe, and then it takes just a day to 3 or 4 days for them to fully ripen, and then they get frozen.
Got it.
They get destemmed and then frozen, which is a real pain, but it's worthwhile. I tried fermenting them without destemming them, and it's a inferior product. So I go through the trouble of plucking all this sticky, spiky ends of them.
Oh, so the stem or like the petals, like
it's
the
the leftover. It's the leftover petals.
Okay.
On the end, and also the stem itself.
And the stem itself. Got it. Okay.
I just want to add to your question about why we went down this road.
Yeah, please.
We're in New Hampshire, and it was really clear to us in the very early days of coming up with this idea together that the idea of bringing grapes from all around the world to New Hampshire to, as we said, make somebody else's wine made no sense as a business model, and for many other reasons. Certainly not from an environmental standpoint, and not from a quality standpoint. In terms of wanting to make the best quality wine, a harvester who harvests grapes in California will harvest the grapes early in the morning and have them in the crusher to stemmer before the sun comes up in some cases, because the freshness of the fruit out of the vineyard is key to a successful wine. So putting it on a truck and driving it 3,000 miles across the country and coating it in a bath of chemicals to keep them fresh doesn't make any sense. And so that was the main reason. And a lot of wineries do this. And there's wineries all over New England who their entire production is based on imported fruit. And we didn't want to be part of that process. And we weren't farmers. And so starting a vineyard and growing hybrid grapes and becoming good enough farmers to do that in an organic way really wasn't feasible in the early days. We didn't have the land, we didn't have the technology or the skills, and so the only thing left to us was to think about what grows here. And I share all of the same ideas that Ken, and I think probably Chuck would say the same, that what a cool thing that we have this great fruit that grows here, and that we can turn that fruit into a wine that we can enjoy in the same way we would enjoy a Cab from California, or a Sangiovese from Italy, or a Pinot Noir from Burgundy, and so that became our mission. Is, we all had the opportunity to try great wines from around the world, and some of those wines are what we really enjoyed drinking. And so how do we take the fruit that grows here, and instead of making what is most commonly grown and made here when you work with the local fruit, which is usually a sweeter beverage that is more unlike classic wine than it is like, how can we take that same fruit and craft something that is going to satisfy the same kinds of interest to us as would be satisfied by a classic grape wine?
That's part of the key here too, Adam. That may not be conveyed, is that we don't make typical fruit wine. We make
Right.
we make wine that tastes like wine, but wine that you've never had before, because it's not made out of a grape that you're familiar with or a region you're familiar with. It's like vinifera based wines. They're dry, they're age worthy, they're well structured, they pair well with food, they do all those things that wines do. And I mean, we wouldn't be down this path if it didn't actually work. It was those early days when we were fermenting zucchinis and tomatoes and blackberries and Japanese knotweed and all sorts of crap, that some of that was plonk. It wasn't something that we could pursue. But when we started working with various fruits that did work, I was like, well, crap, you don't have to sweeten the hell out of this to make mouthfeel. You don't have to deaden all the aromatics and notes by adding a ton of sugar. If you're selective in your fruit, you can make a dry wine that has body, that has mouthfeel, that has structure, that is wine. And
Yeah.
and that's what's so compelling about this, is it actually works. And there's no secret to it. It's straight out. We put all our information out there. We publish it. I give talks on it. We're open source, ready to share it all, give it all away, to foster the utilization of what grows locally with you. If you work with it, as opposed to trying to force it to be something, you can actually make some really, enticing, satisfying, interesting products.
So
Yeah.
so just a few months ago, Ken and I were invited to a annual event that's been happening now in the East for 7 years. A wine writer down in Maryland or Pennsylvania brings together who he feels are the best winemakers on the East every year, to put on a symposium where winemakers can be in a room together and share their knowledge and share their wines with each other, and talk about those wines and pick them apart, and talk about what's working and not working. And for the first time in this symposium's history, somebody showed up with wines on the table that weren't made from grapes. It had
Right.
never happened before, and we had a chance to share our wines side by side with some fabulous white and red and rosé wines from all over the East Coast, from as far north as New Hampshire and Maine, and as far south as Virginia, and Ken's wines were able to hold their own in a crowd of very serious wine drinkers. So I think that speaks volumes about how far we've come, creating a beverage that can be taken seriously on the same table as classic vinifera or hybrid wines that have been made for years, decades.
Yeah. I mean, I'd take it even further than you guys and point out that, when you talked about Cab from Napa and Sangiovese from Italy and Pinot from Burgundy, one of those isn't actually from there. And yeah,
Right.
California doesn't have vinifera natively. And, so I'm
Right.
working with things like prickly pear in my winemaking out here, and pomegranate and lemon, because they do really well here as well. But yeah, it's I'm fully on board with that approach. I think it's revolutionary. I'm really excited to talk to you guys because of that. I mean, there's one of my favorite producers of wine in Texas is making wine from also prickly pear, but also mesquite and juniper and Texas persimmons. So
Awesome.
he's just literally just foraging those on his ranch, in Texas, on his family's ranch there. So just
That's great.
really asking the same question as you, like what's already here and doing well, and let's turn that into something beautiful and show what this place actually tastes like, as opposed to somebody else's wine from somewhere else made in their style.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah, it seems so obvious once you stumble upon those questions. But that the giant question on your website of does it have to be a grape? So when you started down this path, I mean, it sounds like you've built something where you have a following and a reputation that is supporting a decent business. But when you started down this path, what was it like? Was it rocky getting out there? Was it a lot of individual education?
We actually are. We're actually adrenaline junkies. We like mountain biking off of cliffs. We like sailing on the edge of high winds. We like skiing off steep slopes. So it's not really been rocky.
Nice. All right.
Well,
Like
the other side of that question is, or the other side of that coin is, it's whatever it was, it still is.
Right.
The world is not throwing open their arms for the latest and greatest wine made from kiwi berries and rose hips. So it's the way in which we've had to convince the world that we had something to offer 10 years ago when we were operating out of my basement and out of my master bedroom, is still the way to this day that we have to, person by person, as they come through the doors of our winery, help them see the world in a different way. And I don't know that we're ever going to be without that challenge, that our business is always going to be sort of hinged on our ability to keep beating this drum and keep getting the word out there that everything doesn't have to be Cab Merlot and Chardonnay. That there are other ways to enjoy a fine beverage with dinner than those three. And I think it will be an uphill battle till we're long gone and buried. So.
Have you noticed any changes at all in whether it's generational acceptance or anything else,
Yes,
or just
yes.
okay?
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
Oh, yeah.
And there's some good news on the horizon. I think younger people today are far more open to the concept of craft beverages and the experimentation that goes along with it in the modern day. And I think that's for a lot of different reasons, not the least of which the craft beverage industry is on a boom right now and has been for the last 10 or 20 years. There's craft breweries on a scale that hasn't been in effect since pre-prohibition. There's meaderies that are taken off like crazy. We went from having maybe 50 in the whole country to having, in close to 1,000 or more meaderies. And there's people experimenting with hybrid grapes like never before. There's people experimenting with fruit like we're doing. And so I think the craft beverage industry has really busted open this idea, especially for younger people who have an open mind, who haven't had their minds corrupted by the old stodgy few who think that wine is only made in France by French people, and
Right.
and so yeah, that door is opening up. And what's also been exciting is that more and more people on a larger scale, the wine media, has gradually begun to accept this as part of the conversation. Whereas 10 years ago, it was really unheard of to hear a major wine media outlet willing to talk about in any kind of seriousness wine made from things other than grapes. And now I see it happening on a pretty regular basis. I'll tell you just a real quick story, and I'm not going to identify the media outlet, but there was a national media outlet that sent a reporter to New Hampshire to spend a week doing a story on wine in New Hampshire. And the reporter that they selected to do the story was someone who did not drink alcohol. So this was, this spoke volumes to me about the level of seriousness that the national media took wineries in New Hampshire
Right.
because it wasn't about the wine at all. It was entirely about the experience, the tasting bar, the traveling,
Right. The
the
tourism
tourism
aspect,
piece
right?
of it,
Yeah.
not the beverage. So
Fascinating.
yeah, so there is hope, and the fight seems to be a little less challenging, but I think we're going to have to keep working very hard to create an openness and a willingness for the larger population to begin to see and understand that not everything has to be made from grapes.
Yeah, that's great. Well, let's talk about some of your ferments. Like, what are some of the fun things that you guys really that do really well for you?
Um, you mean in when you say do well for us, it means in terms of the resulting liquid that we like to drink, number of sales, ease of fermentation. What?
I Yeah, all of the above. I guess. I mean, I'd love
Lake
to
House
hear.
White, Ken. Talk about Lake House White. Talk about Red Scare. I mean,
Oh yeah,
you've got
yeah,
some wines that are just people who walk into our winery who have spent their entire life thinking that grape wine is the only wine and that it's only made in the wine regions of the world will walk in the door and discover Lake House White or Red Scare or some of our other wines and have their minds blown. And so talk
yeah.
about
No,
those, Ken, because there's
that's a good format. So a little background, Adam. All the wines that we make are made like a red wine. So they're all full fruit ferments with everything: stems, skins, seeds, format. And then we end up with whites, rosés, and reds because of the amount of red skin that's included in the ferment. So it's really the materials that dictate that. And Lake House White is a really a nice example, an excellent example of where individual fruits on their own produce a mediocre kind of wine. So if you
Mm,
take a peach and you ferment it, you get a wine that's okay, but nothing like a vinifera-based wine. The individual fruit just doesn't have enough in it to create that magic that some of the vinifera grapes do.
hmm
When you combine a couple fruits, just like you might do with a Rhone Red blend, you end up taking those holes that are in some fruits and filling them with others. And then you start to grab some of the magic that happens. So Lake House White was a long process to be now where I feel pretty comfortable about how it's going to evolve and how it's going to come out. But it's four different components that come ripe at much different times during the growing season. The first is rhubarb, which isn't even a fruit, and
Right.
it pops out early here in New England, so it's harvested and cleaned and chopped and frozen. And then peaches, and people don't really think about New England as being a place for good tasting peaches, but when the peaches grow, when the season is right for peaches in New Hampshire, there's some of the best tasting peaches around that I've ever had from lots of different places.
Mm,
So peaches make up a good component of it. And then there are the wild foraged rose hips that come right after those two. And the Rosa rugosa grows wild all over the place here. It likes crappy soil and grows extremely well on the seashore and sandy soils with salty, rich airs blowing through it. And so we
mm,
go and we harvest a bunch of rose hips. And then the final component, which is critical, is a quince. And
mm.
quince is an old New England standard fruit because it's super high in pectin. Before Knott's figured out that boiling horse hooves could create gelatin and jams were no longer vegan. Before that, people would grow a quince tree and then they could harvest their strawberries and throw a little quince in it, and they would have enough pectin to set that fruit into a jam or jelly.
Ah,
And quince is, extremely astringent, lots of flavor, very aromatic. Most chefs turn it into a paste that's very tasty,
hmm
and it's a critical component for this Lake House White. So those four components, each one on its own, is okay, but pretty singular note. It's like somebody just hitting a couple of keys on a keyboard. And when you combine the four together in a good ratio, you get the magic of a good Chardonnay or a Sauv Blanc or some vinifera based thing where you get nuance and intrigue, and the flavors pull you along, and it's done as a a bone dry barrel aged wine. Um, I have to The way I describe it when I give talks is I sort of create a grape in my mind, and then physically the 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 individual fruits don't have enough sugar to create 22, 24 bricks to get the alcohol that we want. The individual fruits may not have enough juice. A Rosa Rugosa rosehip
Right.
is pasty. There's not much
Yeah.
juice in there. And then, contrary to that, the quince, if you were to press and ferment straight quince juice, it would be so damn flavorful and astringent. It's too intense, so it needs to be watered down.
Hmm.
So I sort of work with the fruits and veggies, water, and some sort of fermentable to craft something that comes together. It's very beer brewing in nature, and
Hmm.
that's where my roots are. So I've got
Yeah.
different components that I'm going to bring together. So every one of the wines that we put together at Hermit Woods is a combination of different variables that I can play with. The amount of water that I use, the amount of fermentable sugar that I use, the type of yeast or that I use, the type of fruit or other materials that I use.
And you guys are pretty minimal. You're pretty minimal in your interventions, as I understand from your website, at least. Is that? I mean, are you doing? Does it naturally go through malolactic, that lake house white, or?
So mallow's a really fascinating thing, and I've been working with that for since the beginning,
Yeah.
and what's interesting is um, most of the fruits that I deal with have a tremendous amount of citric acid,
Uh-huh.
and citric spots out just below malic on a paper chromatography. They're pretty close, and they smear over one another.
Yeah.
And of course, the citric isn't going to go change through all the bacteria. So some of the wines, I try to put them through MLF, and some I don't. The Lake House White I split in half. And this is kind of like some of the things that's done in Chateauneuf and elsewhere, where some of the
Yeah.
wines will be barrel aged and some of the wines will stay in a neutral tank
Yeah.
to
And
preserve
steel.
some of the fresh
Yeah.
fruitiness, and then those are blended. So the Lake House White, about half of it gets barrel aged, and all my barrels are saturated with mallow. But some of it, there's a small change in the size of the malic spot and the size of the lactic spot on paper chromatography. But I don't send stuff out to a lab. I don't really care. In the end, it's about the taste of the wine. And over the years, ricocheting along, trying different things, I really like where the Lake House White has gone. I mean, Chuck was in my basement. Remember that first ferment of rose hips, Chuck, down in the basement?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's disgusting.
this weird mass of floating little white seeds in this barrel. But it's somehow has worked out. And again, I come back to the quality of the ingredients that allow this person to sort of foster
So
something to come out.
something you're saying, Ken, is ringing a couple bells for me that have been really interesting to me as we've gone along. Right from the beginning, you talk about trying to be not to intervene too much and not to use chemistry in the process. You know, at times along the way, we could really use some more tannin, and of course you can buy tannin in the form of a powder and just add it to your wine. And
Right. Well, we don't do
there are
that.
lots of yeah. And so early on, Ken's like, well, we need to find something like. And we discovered these autumn berries that were really astringent and had lots of tannin. And then we discovered this tea that was this Indian tea. It's made from sumac and steeping these sumac flowers in liquid to extract the tannins because they're very high in tannin. and using that in some of the recipes. And so building the recipes out of the fruit and the ingredients that exist in nature and in the wilds, and not being tempted to just go to the store and buy the additives necessary to build the wine that you're trying to make. And
Yeah,
another thing
that's a great point, because there is no acid adjustment, there's no tannic powder added, there's none of that goes on. Just trying to understand what the fruit brings to the glass from this area.
and the other thing that brings to mind is, watching Ken over the years. At this point, wine takes a long time, and we have about 30 or 35 different wines that we produce every year. Only a handful of those are at a large scale. A lot of them are a much smaller scale, but nonetheless, that's 35 wines a year. What we're doing isn't being done anywhere else. There's nobody to ask, how does this work, or how do you change this, or if you change this, what will happen? So at 35 wines a year, it's going to take decades or more to figure out what works and doesn't work, what makes sense and doesn't make sense. And there's no history to feed into this. So
Right.
So Ken has come up with this great process where, a good example, I just to make it easy to talk about, he'll create 4 open top fermenters of blueberries to produce our Petit Bleu. And each of those open tops might experience a different yeast. So we get 4 different yeasts affecting the wine, and then pulled off as a carboy, and he'll follow that carboy through the entire year to see what that one yeast did to that blueberry. And then we'll have, one variable at a time. We'll have 1 year, he'll have 4 different yeasts, and what do they do to the fruit? 1 year might be 4 different press strategies or maceration strategies, or any number of things. And Ken, you can speak to it. But so what Ken has ultimately done is, because of multiplying each batch by all of these smaller batches, Ken's made thousands of wines. We've been doing this only for, commercially for 12 years, and he's literally probably made well over 1,000 wines, so that we can speed up the learning process that's going into figuring out how do you put these things together in a way that makes a really lovely product.
Right. That really was one of the biggest frustrations early on, Adam, was that so many of these wines need 5 years to 10 years to see what they're going to do. And coming from the brew standpoint, where I could brew a beer and 3 weeks later I could know what it's going to taste like, or 3 months later, that's fine. I can adjust it and make some changes to the formulation and do it again and see what it's like. But with wine, if I got to wait 10 years, 5 years for something to show itself, I'm going to be in trouble. So this was my way of accelerating that. I'm 61 years old, and I needed to be able to move this forward as quickly as possible. And so I have 100 or 120 different containers that I ferment and age in, and they all have something in them at some point in time. And that's been my method of exploring and tweaking different variables that Bob talked about to try to put this together. And fortunately, we've created a culture. There are no expectations for what we're going to produce out of Hermit Woods, other than really tasty, unique products. And so that leaves it open. So I remember when our Petit Bleu Reserve, Ray Isle from Food and Wine Magazine, called it out as the best craft beverage in the state of New Hampshire. And my wife likes our Petit Bleu, and she goes, "There, now, see that? You nailed it. Now you're just going to do that again, right?" And I'm like, no, I think I can make it better.
The other thing that also comes to mind is, in the early days, to shine some light on the way in which Ken had to figure this out. We obviously have to capitalize most, if not all, of our wines in some way. We need alternative fermentables. The Brix levels of most of the fruit that grows here in the Northeast hover around 10, 12, 14, we're really lucky 18 Brix. There's a couple of exceptions, kiwi berries being one of them. But since right out of the gate, we knew we were going to have to find some fermentable sugar, we started the process by making sugar wine. If we're going to add sugar to our ferments to bring the alcohol up, we need to know what that sugar is contributing. So Ken made sugar wines, beet wine, sugar, corn syrup wine, cane sugar wine, corn sugar wine, all these various sugars that we could get our hands on in volume. And we added the sugar to water, and he added pitch to yeast and fermented it out to finish to dry, and bottled it and aged the bottles for 3 or 4 months so that we could uncork them and say, okay, this is what sugar makes, and make the best possible decisions about what sugar additions we're going to put in our wine so that we get the least contribution of flavor and aroma from the sugar, and we get just alcohol. And then the flavor and aroma that the wine is producing is going to come from the fruit.
Right on. That's very smart. So, and so you do have to chaptalize still for most part. You're not adding, there isn't enough sugar in just the fruit combination.
Correct. Yeah. Okay. So when I build this grape, that's one of the variables is the added fermentable sugar, especially when I dilute something. An elderberry is a super intense little fruit with very little juice. And so right. I may use, a couple kilos per few liters of liquid or of water. Now I've diluted it's 10 bricks down to 2. So now I've got to add some sort of fermentable sugar to bring it up. And like Bob said, it turned out that dextrose, corn sugar derivative, just creates pure ethanol. The yeast are happy with it. So that's an additive that goes in during fermentation. And what then happened, Adam, was I realized, well, I don't have to add all this sugar at once. I don't have to add all this water at once. I don't have to add this fruit all at once. So instead of just picking grapes at ripeness and crushing them and fermenting them, the yeast have to handle 24 bricks. They have to handle their environment that they're in. I can actually coax them along any way I want. So I will often start off. I have let's say I'm gonna make a wine with let's say I'm gonna do Lake House White, and so I have these ingredients, and I'm gonna use a certain amount of water and a certain amount of sugar. Well, I can add the bulk of the water right at the beginning and dilute the natural sugars, and I can let the native yeast, or I can pitch a commercial yeast, and let that start to work, acclimate, absorb all the nutrients. And then I can introduce, let's say I'm going to add, 100 kilos of dextrose. I don't have to add it all at once. So I can add it in portions every other day or every few days, depending on how the yeast are doing their thing. I can coax them along, and I don't get tremendous temperature stresses on the yeast. And it ends up building mouthfeel. It builds weight in the finished product. Early on, when I made a blueberry wine, I took blueberries, I took water, and I took a bunch of sugar and threw them in a vat and stirred it up and threw some yeast on it. And I ended up with this hollow, terrible blueberry wine. But then when I started building the wine, coaxing the yeast along through the fermentation, I got to total dryness, and now I had mouthfeel. I had weight. It worked out great. And so that's the way I build and ferment a lot of the wines. And I give talks about this approach, this process of building a grape and a sort of a sequential or staged sugar addition to the fermentation.
Wild, yeah. That's fascinating. Well, and then I was going to ask, just on since we're on the technical side, and this was kind of what I was leading to with my question about MLF, do you have to stabilize it then in any way? Like, do you have to cold crash it, or are you doing normal things like
so that? I don't have any tartrates to worry about at all. And I'm in the midst, well, I have been in the midst for experimenting on the hot side stability with proteins with bentonite. So I have used bentonite for heat stability, but I'm not sure that I really need to do that. There are a couple wines I know I don't need to do that on. So I'm working through my repertoire of different wines to see if I can eliminate that.
Yeah.
The wines that I back sweeten, so if I have a really tangy cranberry based wine that is going to get back sweetened, I will sterile filter that just as a commercial entity to protect it from exploding in somebody's trunk.
Right.
But that's it. I use a little bit of sulfur at low levels to stabilize the wine through bottling.
Uh-huh. Any
That's about it.
you doing any sparklers or just all still?
We do some stills. I have a small bright tank to force carbonate. We make some hard cider that I force carbonate.
Oh, okay.
I've done some pet nats, but I didn't enjoy the results, so we don't do those commercially. There's a winery nearby us, Flag Hill, that has a Charmat tank, so we send some of our cuvées over there to get up to 5 bars to have a more intensely sparkled product.
Okay. Majority still? Or
Majority is still.
okay. So you talked about the Lake House White. What about the Red Scare? Can you want to break that one down too?
Sure. I love how Bob throws out a couple of my favorite wines. I think, and rightfully so, they're wines that really create something where the sum is greater than the parts that go into it. Red Scare is a delightful, dry red wine. The somewhat similar to a Burgundy, but it's got its own character. It's really briar fruit forward in its aromatics and flavor profile. It is a mead, but it's a dry mead. There are some complex sugars in the honey that don't ferment out. So the final gravity is a little bit higher than the wines that I produce with just water and dextrose. Those have a final gravity of 992 or 994, and Red Scare will be at 998 or 1. So there is a perception of sweetness from the honey aromatics, and that's melded with the dark fruits. It's a combination of blueberries and blackberries in equal proportions, and then about 15%, 10 to 15% black raspberries, which are a very intense, very aromatic fruit.
Okay.
It's not 100% honey as the added fermented sugars. I didn't like too much of the strong honey notes coming through. So about 5 or 6 years ago, I carved out a little bit of the honey and replaced that with dextrose to make something a little bit more balanced in its flavor profile. The name came from a ultimate frisbee team my son was playing on his freshman year in college, because he's the guy that set up the beehives in my backyard, and this was when I foraged my own blackberries, blueberries, and black raspberries on my property. That was the first vintage in '08, and so it's been called Red Scare ever since.
Oh wow! So it's just the 3 berries, and
it's
then
the 3 berries,
the
honey, water,
Neat.
and a little bit of sugar. It's fermented dry, barrel aged in fairly neutral French oak barrels. There's not enough malic in there for it to go through any sort of mallow. It generally barrel ages from 12 to 18 months, depending on the vintage.
Okay.
And is unfiltered and bottled.
Beautiful. Yeah, I love that. Now, I'm looking at, you have this beautiful page on your website that gives visuals of a lot of the ingredients that you work with, and just wanted to list some. Well, the kiwi berry I'm really interested to know more about, but things like green tomato, knotweed, and daylily really interest me as well.
Those are all good things. I'll start with the kiwi berry.
Yeah.
There are, I think, 23 or 27 different types of kiwi on the planet, and one of them is called a cold hardy kiwi berry, and it's like a zone 9 fruit. So it'll grow in very cold climates and may have originated in Siberia or something like that. But it's all over New England. It grows here. In fact, the state of Massachusetts wanted to register it as an invasive species because it was tearing down some old growths and old historic buildings in the Berkshires. But
because it's a
didn't
vine,
pass,
right?
fortunately. And there are people that grow it commercially. So it grows in tough conditions. It grows like a grape. It's got a vine. You need like 1 male plant for every 6 or 8 females. The berries are like a large grape size, like a Gamay grape or something. That has a smooth skin. You cut it open and it's green with little black seeds and tastes just like a kiwi that you'd have from California or something. Right. They can reach up to 28 bricks in New England.
Wow.
It's a crazy high sugar variety. Typically, they'll come in more in the 18 to 22 range, but it can go that high. There's an organic grower, this guy Dave Johnson down in Pennsylvania, who has been growing these kiwi berries for 3 decades now, and he's done lots of grafting, lots of development. He's an organic grower. We sourced from him, but we had troubles with transportation mostly. And now I work with an experimental grower at University of New Hampshire, Iago. He's got 3,000 different cultivars. He's trying to figure out which ones do best in the soils of New England as a cash crop. They're super nutritious fruit, and they can give a good dollar to the farmers that don't want to try to farm stony land that we have here in New England with the short growing season. So the
Right.
kiwi berry is an intense flavored fruit with very little juice per se. It's very thick and snotty as a fruit pulp to try to get the juice out of it. But I let the yeast do the magic for me. So I like, just like all my wines, it's a full fruit ferment. So all the kiwi berries go into the ferment. I do add some water to lighten up the flavor because it's really intense on its own. Although I have done 100% straight kiwi wines that they lend themselves more to a dessert wine, a sipper, because they're so intense.
Mm.
They're very high in ascorbic acid. They're a strange beast to work with. I'm still struggling after 15 years of working with this fruit to really nail it down. This last vintage, I thought I had a really good balance. It was drinking a bit like a Sauv Blanc. It was blended with some peaches and some rhubarb with the kiwi, and those three things married together into this just gorgeous, crisp, dry white wine. And no back sweetening, but it was sterile filtered and went into the bottle brilliant. And about 6 months later, it's throwing some strange little white crystals, which I suspect are vitamin C. And I don't know if it's from the oxalic acid in the rhubarb combining with the ascorbic acid in the kiwi. I don't have a clue.
Mm.
But it's just a visual deterrent. The wine still tastes perfect. So it's not, they're worse than little tartaric crystals, but
Okay.
it's one of these things. And I've had challenges. Other times I've had bottles like that go through and they stay clear and beautiful forever.
Beautiful. So high
Um,
in ascorbic acid, so you can drink your wine to avoid scurvy in the long New Hampshire winters.
exactly. You also can't use a Ripper method to figure out what your free SO2 is, because
Ah,
it doesn't work.
gotcha.
Um,
Gotcha.
Daylilies grow all over the place in New England. The classic orange New England daylily. They're on my dirt road where I live, and I I smell them as I walk out my driveway in the morning. And one year, 10 years ago, I think 2012 was the first vintage, I made a daylily mead. So I took honey from my beehives, I took rhubarb from my garden for some natural acid, and I used daylilies from the wild flowers to add a floral note. And I literally just ferment those all together, and it turns out to be a nice, clear wine, light colored wine, with a very sort of summery, aromatic profile to it. So, and I've
Beautiful.
used daylilies a couple other times too with some blends. Those I kind of dry hop. I make a straight honey wine, a mead, and then once that wine is finished fermenting, is stabilized and clarified, then I shove a bunch of flowers, fresh picked flowers, into the mead and let them sit there for a while. So I do that with
Like an infusion.
elderflowers and staghorn sumac and daylilies and wild
Mm,
hops and
gotcha.
different things like that.
So they
What
don't
was
even
what was one of the other ones that you saw on the
like
website?
the green tomato or the knotweed. Yeah.
Okay, so
I mean,
tomatoes are great. Tomatoes are
I've
fun
had a
one to talk
tomato
about.
wine actually. I actually had a really interesting tomato wine once. It was perfectly clear and tasted of tomatoes, but sweet and was nice. Like totally pleasant drinking experience. Totally surprised me.
Yeah, tomatoes are a wonderful fruit, and Bob and I, when we first started this winery, Bob and I walked down to a farm that was at the bottom of the hill from his place, or drove down there, and I got a chance to walk through and taste different tomatoes, and we grabbed 5 different types of tomatoes and we fermented them. We made a little tomato wine our first year in business. And I was always struggling because there was this really nice, crisp, acid-rich white wine underneath stuff that smelled like tomatoes.
Right.
And I didn't want that tomato aroma because that's not what wines smell like. So I did lots of experiments over the years, and I finally cracked it about 3 years ago. I have a farmer, and I have him harvest the tomatoes just before they ripen. So they reach full mature size, but before they turn red, he picks them. And he confirms it every year. Ken, are you sure you want me to pick them before they're ripe? And I said, yes, Bob, I want you to pick them before they're ripe. Pick them and freeze them. Okay, gonna do it again. And that's what he does. And they ferment, and they make this crisp, dry white wine that's just lovely. It's a little bit like when Bob and Chuck and I went to South Africa and fell in love with Chenin Blanc there, it was a grape that we really didn't know well. And we went right to the mothership and it was just fantastic. And this tomato wine has been kind of like that. This last year, we released a wine called Ken's Tomato Folly, and it's a green tomato, or I don't like to call it green tomato because there are green tomatoes that when they're fully ripe, they're green. And that's not what we use. We use a red tomato that's not allowed to turn red.
Right.
So it's an unripe, fully formed red tomato that then is fermented into this white wine that if someone tells you it's tomato, you can find tomato in it. But if no one mentions tomato, you won't find it.
Fascinating. Now, I was asking about knotweed. Is that a wine by itself, or does it go as an ingredient into?
So Japanese knotweed is an invasive plant that grows all over the place in New England, and it looks kind of like bamboo. And it's when it first comes up, it's kind of like a bamboo shoot, and some people call it bamboo, New England bamboo. And you can eat it. It's an edible if you kind of harvest it like asparagus early in the spring when the shoots are first coming up. And it's a huge source of resveratrol. So when people make and sell resveratrol pills for their antioxidant contribution, it's not made from grapes. They may say it's just like red wine grapes, the French conundrum, but it's actually made from Japanese knotweed. So it's a great source of resveratrol. It's
also, I just want to interject, it's the base of a biological fungicide called regalia.
I've heard about that. That's right.
Yeah.
Fascinating. Yeah, it's great. It's a great plant, and I got a bunch of it in my backyard. So one year I'm like, well, okay, I'm going to turn an invasive, something that's not good, but that's healthy for you, into something that's a potent potable. So I harvested a bunch of young knotweed, and I chopped it up, and I fermented it with some water and sugar and yeast, and I made a white wine that smelled just like baby wipes. It was terrible, but as my wife knows, with all this experimentation, she says, well, it's still kind of young. Why don't you just leave it downstairs and see what happens? And she was right. About 2 years later, Bob came over. I remember this, Bob. I don't know if you do, but about 2 years later, he came over and I poured him a glass of something and didn't tell him what it was. And he's like, what is this? Do you remember that?
I do. Yeah, very much so.
The baby wipe aromatic had gone away.
Uh-huh.
And it turned into this nice, there were some vegetal notes for sure, but not in a really strong way that just seemed like you were, drinking an alcoholic smoothie. This had turned into.
I believe I still have a bottle of that in my cellar.
Do you really?
I think so. Yeah.
I think I blew through my last bottle when that guy from NPR was interviewing me here in the backyard. But anyway, the federal government, Adam, will not allow us to commercially sell a wine made out of Japanese knotweed.
Oh,
so
why is that?
So I couldn't prove that it was grass that was generally accepted as safe. And
now,
even though there are some places in Vermont that sell edibles with it, they make omelets and stuff out of it. But so I went around that, and what's that?
Was it a safety concern, or what's the why?
That's what they said. They couldn't. I couldn't.
The FDA doesn't recognize it as food or as a consumable.
Yeah.
Huh. Okay.
It was really disappointing. But
Well, and you guys probably aren't a great, poster children for the effects of it either. So there's that.
well, what we did, what's fascinating is raising bees here in my backyard. When the knotweed is in bloom in late August, the bees love it. They just
Uh-huh.
they just pound on these plants and bring back the nectar. And when they bring back the nectar and put up honey, it looks like molasses. It's this dark black honey.
Mm, mm,
So I have a local beekeeper that puts some hives near Japanese knotweed flowers, and I make a knot mead every year. So I get the honey
oh,
from Japanese knotweed flowers. I have a batch right now, in fact, that just got barreled down yesterday. Bob, wait till you try this. It's the best batch yet, man. It really came through great.
yeah.
This is from this year's Japanese knotweed honey?
This year's Japanese knotweed, yeah.
Aren't you glad I talked you into that?
I'm so glad you did because and it worked out great because he had just harvested it, so it was fresh honey, and it went right into the fermenter, and it worked out great. And I made enough.
Gave any of that for me to put on my toast? Did you? It's my favorite honey.
I did not. Sorry.
There's something about those dark honeys. We've kept bees off and on for multiple years here in LA in our backyard, and the one thing that we loved was just seeing how the color of the honey changed through the seasons, depending on what was in bloom, and you get this beautiful array, a spectrum of colors. And we determined that when the avocados were in bloom was when we got that like deep dark chocolate honey, and loved it. I mean, that was the one that, and then there was one other, the opposite end of the spectrum was like this super thin, perfumey, like floral honey. We could never figure out what it was. It might be the jacarandas that bloom here, these beautiful purple flowered trees that line one of the streets in our neighborhood.
Yeah.
It might have been from that because they're very nectary and perfumey, but it's fun to see that. I love that too. I used to say knotweed is not a weed. Because there's so many great things about it. There's so many great.
That's super, Adam. I fell in love with that same thing with having bees and seeing how the color of the cap changes, and then the character of the honey changes all through the season. So you have multiple harvests. You could do multiple harvests and vintages from one beehive for different meads through the year.
Exactly. Yeah,
which is
amazing.
Really exciting.
Well, what is the name of your video vlog, your weekly video cast is what I'm trying to say.
So unfortunately, fortunately, we just got our new website up and running, and because it took us 2 years to build the website, we decided to launch the core components of the site first before putting the whole enchilada together. And the one component that's about to be released in the next week or two will be the history because you could go to a page 2 weeks ago to our website that showed all 300 episodes that we've done, but they're all on YouTube. So if you search around on YouTube, and I can send you a couple links, and once I send you the name of the show, you could search that name and find all of the episodes. But I assure you, as soon as we can in the next week or two, we're going to have them all back up on our site, so that you can just go to our website and peruse all of the episodes. But
do you want to say? Do you want to say what the URL is, or the name of the show?
Well, Hermit Woods has a YouTube page.
Oh, so it's on the Hermit Woods page. Got it. Okay.
It's on the Hermit Woods channel, the YouTube channel.
Got it. Okay.
And the show that the name that we've been doing building the show on is The Hermit's Live: Captivating and Impassioned Stories of Crafting and Enjoying Fine Wine. So if you were to type that, The Hermit's Live, or any part of that sentence, you'll probably get most of the shows popping right out.
You chose a nice, short, easily type into search engine name. I see.
Yeah. Well, see, I'm a novice at this. See, we started this show because COVID forced us to close our winery for 3 months, and I was desperate to connect back up with our customers. So
Yeah.
I, within weeks of closing, began putting myself out there as wildly as I could on social media. And then, as soon as I could convince Ken and Chuck to join me, the three of us started coming together every week to talk about everything we loved. Most of which is involving fermentation, but not always. We've talked about lots of other things as well, and so it's evolved. And I wish I could say that I've mastered it after 3 years, but no, I'm not even close to mastering it. And yeah, I think the title is in need of help, but out of lack of time to be developing a new title, I've lived with it for a while.
Well, one question I skipped over that I wanted to ask, and you, because you started going down that path anyway, without me even asking you, but as you discovered with knotweed, or yeah, it was knotweed, the aging actually changed it, and I'm wondering if you have any other experience with any of the other strange and unusual, or less, just less experimented with berries or fruits or herbs or anything else, spices, anything that you've worked with where you've found something profound happen as it's aged.
Just about all of them, actually.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Here's a good one for you that I've presented to a couple of winemakers, and everybody just raises their hand that I don't know. It turns out that a wine that you make out of blueberries will eat carbon dioxide.
Mm.
And I don't know why or how it does it, but you can ferment it, and you can ferment it dry, and all the carbon dioxide has gone out of that wine, and it's a still dry blueberry wine. And then if it's in an environment where there's some CO2, it will absorb that CO2. And the way I discovered this was this was back when we first started the winery commercially at Bob's house. And I had some glass carboys, and I also had a few plastic carboys. And I had a tank of carbon dioxide that we would use for sparging bottles before bottling and stuff like that. And I noticed there was a little bit of headspace in this plastic jug of blueberry wine. So I purged that headspace with CO2 and put the bung in. And about a week later, the wine was all the way up in the neck of this plastic carboy. I'm like, what the hell's going on here? So I released the bung, and the plastic carboy expanded back out to full size and sucked a bunch of air into the headspace. I'm like, oh shit, there's air in the headspace. I better clear that with CO2. So I purged it out with CO2 and put the bung on. After about 3 times, I'm like, oh shit, it's just eating the CO2. And I've had it where I have, and this happened early on in the fermentation of blueberry wines. It doesn't happen anymore. And I think it has to do with mechanical punch downs and pump overs. I think the pump overs allow the CO2 to escape. So the larger scale that I make the Petit Blue in now, I'm doing pump overs. But I've had cases where I'm barreling down a batch of blueberry wine. It's in a French oak barrel with a bubbler on it, and it's on a stack of barrels 5 layers high, and the lower level of that stack of barrels is 60 degrees Fahrenheit, and the upper level is like 75 degrees because it's warmer 2 stories high.
Right.
And even at that high level for 2 months, 75 degrees, the CO2 is still trapped in that barrel, to where if I put a spinner in it, it froths over the top. It just blows CO2 out.
It's very
So
strange.
that's a strange one that I still don't know. So whenever I'm pushing Petit Blue through hoses to clear the pump, or I'm bottling Petit Blue, I don't use CO2. I use nitrogen at all times.
Okay, so when you say that it eats it, does that mean it absorbs it and it's now part of the wine, so it sort of carbonates?
It starts to eat it up. If I do it enough, it does. You can detect a tongue tingle to it from the CO2.
So in other words, like it's not a problem if you're trying to make a sparkling blueberry wine, because it's not like it's going to go away. It actually it's more that it sucks it up inside itself rather than letting it
it wants to eat it
out.
Somehow. It's the only wine that I've had that happen to.
That is
I'm not quite sure why. And we do make a carbonated sparkling blueberry wine, which is quite delightful, and it takes a good volume of CO2. It'll eat that up just fine.
Well, this
Another
is
fruit that's been a tremendous challenge to figure out, and still haven't figured it out today, is the kiwi berry. I mean, we have bottles of 100% kiwi berry wine that we made back in 2010, 2011, or 12 that today are in my cellar and are crystal clear, crystal clear. They've not thrown any sediment, and yet uh, subsequent vintages of the same wine using the similar or same recipe after a year throw so much sediment they become cloudy, and everything in between. It seems like the any wine that you've made, Ken, that's included kiwi berries has had these strange anomalies happen
Yeah,
that we
I
just
definitely
don't
don't have that
understand.
figured out. Yeah, I don't have
huh.
that figured out
That
for
is
sure.
wild. Well, very cool. Well, I mean, I'm sure we could, given the number of ingredients that you work with, we could talk all day about everything that you guys do. But is there anything that you guys would like to say just as a wrap up? I want to, not keep you all day and just make this like a listenable episode for people to enjoy. But yeah, no, anything that I missed asking you about, or anything that you think is important to know about what you guys are doing that we didn't cover yet.
Yeah,
I just want to say right out of the gate that it's such a joy to talk to somebody else who gets it, who understands, because so
Likewise.
few people really get it, really understand that there's so much wonderful stuff that can come out of this type of thinking and experimenting, and so it's been a real pleasure hearing you talk about this stuff, and not just hear talk about it but understand it. So thank you.
Fantastic. Yeah. No, I mean, I think it's so funny how much lip service gets paid to the expression of terroir in wine, and we're working with grapes that come from another continent and don't wouldn't thrive without massive crutches, whether it's like constant irrigation or sprays of all different kinds to be able to actually survive and produce a consistent crop in the climates where it's grown around the planet in certain cases. And yet we're concerned about terroir, and it's like, what is more terroir than what you guys are doing? I can't think of anything. Like that's yeah, like that approach. If you want terroir, you have to take that approach. Like if that's just a whole re-examination of what that means in wine. And
Absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah, and it all evolved from Bob and Ken's backyard. The Dogo crab apples, the blueberries, were started from a neighbor's farm, and we live in one of the best blueberry barren regions of the world that our blueberry wine evolved into. And yes, so I agree. It's about terroir. It's about the experience. It's about the flavor of something that it's like to be here that is no other place on earth. I mean, you
Yeah.
can't make a
Isn't
blueberry wine
isn't that
that's
more interesting to
yeah,
anybody?
it's
Like,
much more interesting. I
we
mean,
want to just make the
it's what's
same
here.
wine everywhere around the planet? Like, don't we
Right.
want to try something unique everywhere we go? Wouldn't it be cool to have like a rainbow of diversity in
Right.
the alcoholic beverage industry, that we consider? Yeah, I don't know. Like, it just seems so obvious to me. Yeah.
Well, it's an industry,
yeah.
right? Farmers are growing things, and we're able to create a different path for utilization, and it provides jobs and agriculture and agricultural things that grow here.
Yeah.
What's better than that?
Yeah, that's true. It really supports, local farmers. I mean, we didn't mention this. I saw this on your website, but you're participating in something that provides a living wage for your employees. Do you want to talk about that?
Bob?
Well, yeah. So early on in our winery, I read about another business in Vermont that had to figure out how to put a surcharge onto their meals at a restaurant, and applied that surcharge to the wages of their employees, and was on this mission to figure out how to treat everybody equally and fairly, and I just was so inspired by this concept. All of us were. We looked into it, and we think, well, this is what we need to be doing. You know, I honestly, I'm no better than the guy who has to clean the dishes at our restaurant every day. I'm no better and I don't deserve any more than that person. That person is as integral part of our organization and our business as anybody else. And so we wanted to start operating in that way so that in the best of our ability, we could treat everybody the same, treat everybody equally, and pay people a wage that is a living wage that you can actually afford to live on, because that's not what's happening in most places. And I don't know that we're gonna solve this problem, but we're gonna try. Damn it! So
You might
that's
solve
been
it.
our mission in everything we do, and that's why I say it's really about this culture that the three of us came together and are doing what we're doing because we're inspired by the excitement and energy and passion that comes from building something new, creating a new idea and a new approach and a new way to solve a problem and a new way to think about a beverage that people have thought about differently for thousands of years. So that's an excitement and an energy that just really percolates through everything we do. And that's why I said in the very beginning of this conversation, the relationship that the three of us have is very much at the core of the culture that is the business that we've created, and that culture is very much about, like you said, the creating something that's unique, that's special, that's fair, that supports that supports all of our team, that supports our community. I mean, it's been as important to me to be successful as a business as it has been for us to be successful in our community, on our main street in this small town of Meredith, and let the town of Meredith share in our success, and vice versa. So yeah, I think that's been an important context of our business since the beginning.
Well, thanks, guys. This has been really great talking to you. Like you said, it's just great to connect with folks who have this approach. It's like nice to know you're out there, first of all, just as to bring hope to my life and hopefully to others who are starting to have the same kind of thinking. But I think, as we move into into the 21st, deeper into the 21st century, where I think so much of what has been considered the traditional wine industry is being put to a stress test and failing. And as you guys were saying, younger consumers less and less care about that quote unquote traditional wine industry, that wine culture,
right?
Yeah.
And are buying less and less of it. I think the answer is essentially what you guys are doing. So hats off and congratulations. And I can't wait to try all of these things.
Thanks so much, Adam. Real pleasure.
Yep. Pleasure, Adam.
Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. And if you did and would like to support this podcast, there are many ways that you can. Patreon is something that you can subscribe to financially support this podcast. That link is in the show notes. And a big thank you to all of the folks who already subscribe on Patreon. You guys actually make this possible, and I am so grateful for you and for your support. Also, you can buy wine from Centralis Wine. I mentioned them at the beginning of this episode. It is my winery, and the proceeds definitely help this podcast because it is the premier sponsor for this podcast. And if you don't want to drink amazing, delicious wine or, sign up via Patreon, there are some other non-monetary ways that you can support, like just leaving a great review or telling your friend about this podcast. It's all helpful. It's all much appreciated. Thank you so much.